Welcome back to the Health Marketing Collective, where strong leadership meets marketing excellence. I'm your host, Sarah Payne, a health marketing strategist at Imprella Communications, and I'm bringing you fascinating conversations with some of the industry's top marketing minds. Today, we're diving into a very important topic, inclusive marketing in healthcare. Stigma and fear often prevent people from seeking the care that they need, leading to poor health outcomes and perpetuating cycles of shame and misinformation. From substance use disorders to mental health challenges, many conditions are shrouded in stigma, causing people to hide their true experiences from their doctors and their loved ones. As marketers, I believe we have the unique power and responsibility to challenge these stigmas, drive social change, and promote a more inclusive healthcare system. Joining me in this conversation is an expert who's passionate about breaking down these barriers and fostering a more inclusive approach to health marketing. Our guest is Melissa Fors Shackelford, Senior Vice President of Marketing at Let's Get Checked, where she leads global marketing strategies. Let's Get Checked is a healthcare solutions company that specializes in home health testing, virtual care, genetic sequencing, and medication delivery for diverse conditions. Melissa has over 25 years of experience as a health marketing executive with industry-leading organizations like Optum, Hazelden Betty Ford, and Cigna's health services business, Evernorth. It's quite an impressive background. I'm honored to have you with me for this episode. Melissa, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. I have been looking forward to this so much.
Likewise, like I said, such an important conversation that I felt was really important to bring to this show and to our audience. I'd like to start by diving into some real world examples that really bring to life the impact that stigma can have on healthcare outcomes. Do you have some stories or a story that you can share with us?
Oh, absolutely. And I think because you mentioned Hazelden and Betty Ford, I was in behavioral health care with substance use disorder and mental health for a long time, and I have lots of examples there. And that's really where I became so passionate about breaking down stigma. So my example I like to use is if you had a teenager who needed braces, you probably are going to do a lot of work before you get them braces. You're going to ask your neighbors, you're going to ask your co-workers, you're going to ask your cousin, who do you use for an orthodontist? You're going to ask questions about health insurance. Was this an orthodontist? Did they have good outcomes? What was the experience for your child? All those kind of questions. But if your teenager has a substance use disorder, odds are you're not going to talk to anyone because of that shame and stigma that you feel. You're not going to go to the counselor at school, who you probably should go to. You're not going to talk to the teachers. You're not going to talk to your neighbors. You're probably not going to talk to your cousin. You're not going to even maybe talk to your primary care physician because of that stigma. How does that reflect on me as a mother? I don't want them to treat my child differently. And so I can often be preyed upon by unsavory actors. I can maybe take my child to get care at the wrong place, not get them the best care that they need. And all of that is just because of the fact that I feel so ashamed and afraid of this condition. And the more we can do to sort of break down that stigma, bring those conversations into the light from the dark, we're going to start getting people the care that they need, the appropriate care that they need, and at the right time. And we're going to have better informed healthcare consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it sort of, it hurts a little to hear you say all of that. But we know it to be true, right? Like this is real. The stigma around many of these conditions is so real, but to think about it from the standpoint that we would be preventing ourselves or a loved one from getting the absolute best care out of fear of others judging us hurts when we think about that on like a societal level, right? That this is where we are in the collective whole. And this is the whole point of having this conversation today is what can we do to really change that cycle of stigma and shame to really have different outcomes here.
Exactly. And that's where your audience, healthcare marketers, as healthcare marketers, we can do a lot to change the dialogue. We can work really hard to break down stigma by using appropriate language, using different imagery, making sure we start to talk about these conditions because they're healthcare conditions. We can talk about them in a more supportive light. And I think one of the things that's happened recently is Oprah Winfrey did a big seminar on weight loss and breaking down the stigma around obesity as a disease. And I feel like if we can do more things like that, people will get the care that they need because obesity is a disease and there is care available. And luckily, it's now become part of our general conversation, which a few years back, again, that's another condition that people are often feel ashamed about. They're not going to say, hey, I need help for this obesity as a disease. I'm not going to necessarily find the right doctor, or find the right care, find the right medication because I feel so stigmatized and so ashamed.
Yeah. And that's a great example with Oprah and the conversation changing around obesity. And there may be multiple factors here, but clearly one of the big factors influencing that was the entrance of the GLP-1 drugs to the market, right? Everyone was talking about it. It became, celebrity interest. There was a lot of celebrity interest in the drugs, and it just became a part of the mainstream conversation. And there tend to be big triggers like that, big moments that happened. And another example is how COVID and social isolation led us to be talking much, much more openly about mental health, depression, anxiety, and the prevalence of those conditions and those experiences. So on the one hand, you can have a major global event like a pandemic, or the entrance of a brand new, drug treatment therapy to the market, or to your point, we could have brands and marketers sort of stepping up and leading campaigns that really drive and change the conversation around this.
A lot of it, I think there's simple things that we as healthcare marketers can do. Just like obesity, calling obesity a disease, not calling a person obese saying he has obesity or is a person living with obesity. Same thing for substance use disorder. Oftentimes it's still called substance abuse, which again, that's just such a judgmental term. If we use the appropriate medical term, which is substance use disorder, it takes all the judgment out of that. And he is not a substance abuser. He is a person with substance use disorder. Same thing around mental health. I think we've gotten pretty good, but we still have a ways to go. They're just like calling someone a schizophrenic versus someone who has schizophrenia. Think about cancer. We don't say he is cancer. We say he has cancer. And then also just as healthcare communicators, we think about the language matters. Is he suffering from something or is he living with something? So a lot of that is there's a nuance, but that's where healthcare marketers in particular, we can start to change the way the world talks about things. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us. And so again, I applaud you for bringing this up on your the Health Marketing Collective.
Yeah, it is such a huge opportunity because we are raised by, in family circles, in certain cultures, to have a certain common language. And let's face it, sometimes that's not inclusive language, but we perhaps didn't know at a point in our lives, didn't know any better. Well, now we do know better, right? And we can notice ourselves when we're using language that perhaps isn't inclusive, but for sure, making sure that we've got really stringent filters on marketing and educational material to really, really lean into that judgment-free language.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even from marketers, that's the language, it's also the imagery we use. When we think about how do we show people in different lights, we can show them in a much more positive light or a much more negative light. So again, it's how healthcare marketers, we can shape the way people talk about healthcare. We can shape the way they talk about different diseases that people are living with.
Yeah, in the interest of giving some other practical advice to marketers, you've mentioned inclusive language being really important, representation within imagery in our marketing materials being really important. You had also shared with me a story, Melissa, about doing an inclusive marketing audit when you were at Hazelden Betty Ford. Can you talk a little bit about sort of like, I mean, I think we sort of intuitively know what an inclusive marketing audit is, but just sort of walk us through what you did as an organization and what you learned from that.
So as an organization, we had a third party coming in and helping us with our care, but we also asked them to take a look at our marketing. And I thought, oh, we're going to get an A++ because I believed our marketing had a lot of diversity as far as imagery. When you think about age and gender and race and people in the LGBTQIA plus community. So I thought, oh, we're going to ace this inclusive marketing audit. But there were two things that they called us out on. And I've really taken those to heart. And one was that we didn't have enough people living with disabilities in our imagery. And that was something when we think about healthcare, and at us the time at Hazelden Betty Ford, we were a very accessible substance use disorder treatment organization. And so, yes, we should have leaned into that. So people living with various disabilities would want to come to an organization like ours because we were so accessible, but we weren't really illustrating that. I think maybe we had one picture of a person in a wheelchair, but that gets back to making sure we have diversity on our marketing team so people are thinking of that. And we didn't necessarily have that much diversity. That's where having neurodiversity on your marketing team or in your collective stakeholder group, having different physical disabilities, all the different things, that's where having that diversity of thought is so important. So one, we kind of got dinged on the people living with disabilities. And secondly, we got dinged for size. And by size, I mean, we were just showing all these shiny, happy models. Sure. And weren't showing people of different sizes. And that was really important to not just have all these stock photography models. And the organization that did our audit actually showed us there's other stock. If you want to use stock imagery, there's other places you can go. You might have to pay a little bit more, but to really think about it, when we're in healthcare, we need to reflect everybody because everyone is a healthcare consumer, no matter what. They all are healthcare consumers. So we really need to make sure our healthcare marketing reflects who our audience is, which is everyone.
Absolutely. I'm really curious now if you happen to recall the resource that you use, because I think it's a great tip for folks. Do you remember the stock imagery resource or company that you then switched to and used?
Oh, that's going way back. I cannot think of it, but okay. I think they are multiple ones available. And I think also it's just whichever resource you're using, you can also just be very, very selective on the imagery that you choose. So you can just think, well, I need to make sure I'm showing all the different forms of diversity. I'm showing age, race, gender. I'm showing people living with disabilities. I'm showing different sizes of people. LGBTQIA plus community. I mean, there's a lot of different things that if you're very conscious from a marketing perspective, to say, I want to reflect my audience, which are healthcare consumers.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was just out shopping the other day with my daughter, and I will say, I don't think fully inclusive imagery is yet like baked into mainstream culture because I tend to notice it. Like I was at Target and I was loving the diversity of imagery that I was seeing just walking around, from the kids section to the home section and seeing, the faces that they were showcasing. And I was in awe of the diversity there. But that again, now I'm a marketer and I pay attention to that stuff. But again, I think it is indicative of the fact that it is not fully mainstream, that it stands out as a shining example of, wow, they seem to really be progressive. And I hate to say that. I hate to say they're progressive for doing that, but I think that is part of the reality of where we are today as brands and marketers.
Yeah, and I feel like we have even more responsibility as healthcare marketers. I did about Target. I just read an article about a little boy who was at Target, a little boy who wore hearing aids, and he saw one of the models had hearing aids. It's very simple. When we think about in healthcare,
So simple.
how hard is it for us to have hire models with hearing aids? But again, it gets back to making sure we have diversity on our marketing teams, that our marketing teams are made up of people, not just our marketing staff, but our broader stakeholder group, the agencies we use, all of that they have that kind of diversity of thought. So when they're coming from all different walks of lives, they're thinking of that. I might not think of making sure we have a little boy wearing hearing aids, but someone else might. And so that's what's, I think, even more important in our areas of business than other areas.
And such a great point you made about diversity of thought and making sure you have that within your team, whether you hire against that, which, yes, of course, hire against diversity of thought, but additionally, bringing in outside consultants that really specialize in this and are going to challenge us maybe in areas where, we're not fully seeing that full picture, not with any intention. It's just perhaps an area, we might have thought we were doing excellent, but there's a couple of boxes that perhaps were left unchecked.
There's some great resources and consultants out there, whether you're looking at inclusivity, diversity, organizations that specialized with inclusive marketing, focusing on disabilities. There's lots of great resources, and that's what we need to leverage. So we're not speaking for them. They can help us to make sure we're speaking about things in the correct way and the way that those audiences want to be spoken about. And again, it's even more important because we're in healthcare and everyone needs to be receiving healthcare in some way, shape, or form, if not for themselves, then for their loved ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about some of the areas where real progress have been made and maybe some of the areas that haven't benefited from much by way of progress, maybe where we as brands and marketers need to put more emphasis. We've talked a little bit about how really the conversation around, anxiety and depression, that has really come into the forefront. That has really changed. I think obesity is just sort of on the front end of driving some meaningful change. I think there's more that needs to happen there. A couple that I see as areas that are really untapped and need to be leaned into more heavily would be the intellectual and developmental disabilities, and also ageism. I think is huge. That really needs to be leaned into more. What are your thoughts, Melissa? And feel free to challenge me on this too if you see it differently.
I just read something about older people are most often shown as living with disabilities in advertising. And so I think that just perpetuates stereotypes. So I work with an organization that is focused on senior living. And that organization has been doing a campaign that's my senior moment. And then they have a picture of someone doing a rock climbing wall. Or cool. My senior moment is I'm kayaking. And so they're trying to put a spin on that. And I love that because we shouldn't stereotype seniors as being the people living with disabilities only. We should be also celebrating that people, at least in this particular campaign, that they're thriving, that they're doing rock climbing, they're kayaking, they're doing all sorts of things. So I think that's one of those barriers that we can work on, is that especially we as marketers, we can break down some of those stereotypes, and we can be cautious about perpetuating those. So same thing with substance use disorder and mental health. That was something I think we always tried to think about was, are we perpetuating a negative stereotype? Are we showing imagery that's perpetuating a negative stereotype? Or frankly, with substance use disorder, some of the imagery you could show, or some of the B-roll that goes when there's stories on the news, it's very triggering to people who may be living in recovery. We don't want to be showing things that are triggering to them, but we want to be showing the positive instead of the negative, and we don't want to be the ones perpetuating those negative stereotypes.
Absolutely. Do you have some other powerful examples of marketing or educational campaigns that really stand out in their efforts to remove stigma or promote more inclusivity?
Yeah, I can think of two. The first one I'll talk about is the American Lung Association. And I have spoken about this before. I used to be on their board. It's an amazing organization. And one day at a board meeting, one of their leaders in the marketing organization came in and talked about a campaign they were doing. And the American Lung Association could do a campaign about just about anything. And what they chose to really focus on for that particular campaign was former smokers. And if you talk about a stigmatized group in healthcare, it is current or former smokers. And even when you talk about lung cancer, oftentimes people say, well, oh, he got lung cancer, but he was never a smoker. So that makes it okay, versus if he was a smoker or a former smoker,
right,
he deserved it. We all know that smoking is highly, highly addictive. And so it's something that I think we need to think twice about. What the Lung Association did is they leaned into this campaign to former smokers because they were not learning about, there was a life-saving scan, an early scan to do early lung cancer detection. But when people were a former smoker, oftentimes they weren't having that conversation with their primary care provider, because they're not walking in and saying, oh, I used to smoke a bunch, but I quit. They're walking in and saying, I don't smoke. So what the Lung Association was trying to do was reach these former smokers saying, hey, if you smoked, you need to ask about this early detection scan. And the numbers were astronomical for the people that were getting the scan and the people that were finding things early stage, because I think we all know the horror stories of people finding out they have lung cancer at a late stage. Really, I just applaud the Lung Association for leaning into a highly stigmatized condition and also working to save lives. But also they understood that these former smokers were not having these conversations with their primary care providers because they didn't want to tell them, because they were ashamed, what have you, of having been a smoker. And yes, they should be applauded that they quit, but they also need to get the care that they need. So I love that. I think it was bold. I think it was smashing stigma. They were putting their money in an area where they could really, really save lives. The other one that I love, and I'm assuming you've seen some of them, are all the wonderful work that's been happening around HIV/AIDS.
Yes.
And I think about the pharma companies that are advertising on NFL games, on network television, and they're not showing people suffering. What they're doing is showing people living shiny, happy lives, and they're getting married, and they're rock climbing, and they're doing all these things. And they're targeting that audience saying, hey, we have this medication available for you. I just think those campaigns that are on TV those last few years are just doing so much to break down stigma, a very highly stigmatized condition. But they're saying, we're going to throw stigma out the door. We're going to say, show everyone that people are living these wonderful lives. And we're speaking to this audience because we do have these medications available. I just think those are two campaigns that are very visible, but also really leaning into the stigma and just throwing it out the window. And I think it helps to change what the conversation is in this country.
Yeah, two really great examples there. Thank you for sharing, because I think we all need inspiration from time to time, right? Of what others are doing, because I think it takes some courage sometimes to do those things. I have one more example that I recently came across. There is a campaign that is called "Ageism is Never in Style," and this campaign is to really improve the representation of specifically midlife women and older, and their goal is to really change the narrative around aging. Now, it's not specific to healthcare, because they're also driving conversation change in the fashion and beauty industries, but I can see it having tremendously positive impacts on healthcare, because if people of certain age groups are cast aside by society, then we won't prioritize advocating for them, innovating for their special needs, right? Where is the specific health tech needs, innovations and needs for these different age groups? So anyway, check that one out too. There's, for our listeners, there's a website with that name. They did have a podcast for a while. I'm not sure if it's still ongoing. They're also on Instagram and LinkedIn. It's called Ageism is Never in Style. And that one to me is an example of someone really, just like the the lung cancer example, really actually leaning into the stigma, right? And saying this is a problem, and we're gonna directly go right at it and change that conversation. So I love that.
There are so many great marketers out there changing the narrative. I love it. I wrote that one down. I'm going to definitely look it up.
Yeah, and there's another sort of factor to all of this that's very real in my day-to-day world too, that I think can contribute to perpetuating stigma, and that is the reality of what gets press coverage and what doesn't. I mean, I've seen situations where journalists aren't as interested in covering certain health condition, and I believe that it's due to stigma. As an example, we have a client that's in the liver disease space. Liver disease is driven by certain lifestyle choices, mm-hmm. and those choices are stigmatized in our society. But to your earlier point, obesity is a disease. Alcoholism is a disease, right? Mm-hmm. Both increase the risk of liver disease, and nobody deserves to get that, especially not because they had a disease that was difficult for them to get under control because they didn't have support. So I believe very strongly that the media needs to be part of the conversation, and they can really help drive education and change the stigma. And yet I see stories getting passed over. So I think, again, going back to our role as brand leaders, marketing leaders, that we can help try to change that. Of course, my team is working hard to try to change the realities around this, but I think collectively as marketers, we can put more pressure and come up with some innovative ideas to change this. I mean, what if a big brand, a health insurance company or the likes of that, approached someone like the New York Times or Time Magazine and did a recurring column that was like the health stigma column, and every month or whatever the recurring cadence is, really dive into some of these deep-seated beliefs and behaviors that really continue this cycle of stigma and really lead some efforts to change the conversation. That's an example of what we could do as marketers, is to bring an idea like that and put some money behind it.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of times you'll see the media saying, well, no one wants to hear about that. No one wants to hear about that topic. Well, Oprah did a primetime special on obesity and the GLP-1s and everything that's happening there to break down stigma, talking about obesity as a disease. If, Oprah did it and people watched it.
And the ratings were pretty good from what I understand, right?
So when you can say the media doesn't want to talk about it, but these days they're all talking about GLP-1s.
Yeah, for sure. Well, like I said, I think it takes some courage for brands to step up and champion this change. But I believe this work is already embedded into the mission of many healthcare organizations out there. And if they look within their mission, they will find the permission that they need and the opportunity to really step up and drive change. Do you have any other advice for marketing leaders who maybe, want to do something but are struggling with what to do or where to start?
I think a lot of it goes to starting off by educating yourself and your team. But then beyond that, there is a revenue implication when you're talking about inclusive marketing. I don't have any of the stats necessarily off the top of my head, but there is massive lift. We know that when you are targeting, for example, people living with disabilities, there's a lot of money in that audience, as well as from their loved ones. We know that campaigns work better when they show diverse audiences because people can see themselves and their loved ones in those campaigns. And so I think there's also the revenue play. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, it's the right thing to do, particularly in healthcare. As we talked about, everyone is a healthcare consumer and everyone deserves to be able to get the care that they need. And the more we can do to break down stigma, the more we can do as healthcare marketers to make sure we are inclusive, we're accessible, and that we make it easier for people to reach out their hand for help for whatever condition that they may have. We're getting people the care that they need, and that's what we're about. That's why people are drawn to healthcare marketing versus other industries.
Absolutely. Great point. Well, great advice there, Melissa. Thank you for sharing that. Hopefully we'll inspire some folks to do some things differently And I love your point about the business case because, the reality is we have to, many cases, follow the money on these things. But to your point, I think if they dig in, they'll find the evidence to prove that, in fact, there is business opportunity around any of these areas. All right. Well, I'd like to switch gears for our quick fire segment. I've got 5 questions for you, Melissa. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
I'm going to say ask for help.
Ooh.
And I think not enough of us ask for help or are willing to admit that we need to ask for help. But you have to have an ounce of humility to say you can't do it all yourself. But I think for me, asking for help over and over and over has been one of the best things people have ever suggested to me. And I tell you, I'm surprised over and over at the people that are willing to lend a hand when asked.
So true. So true. What's more important to you, short-term results or long-term investment in the brand?
So that's a toughie. I have to say, and I've watched a bunch of your podcasts, I have to say both. I think you can't sacrifice one for the other, but that's sort of the age-old argument about marketing and marketing budgets. Do you focus on the short term? Do you focus on the long term? But you can't really mortgage your future by sacrificing it. So I'll say both.
True. Yeah, I know. Trick question. One thing I didn't mention when I introduced you is that you serve on the board of the Women's Health Leadership Trust, which is a fantastic organization. And I know you are a strong advocate for female leadership in our industry. I wanted to put you on the spot and have you name some female leaders that you personally look up to or are inspired by.
Wow, that's great. And I can start with some of the women in the trust. I tell you, especially for people who are located, I know you've got listeners everywhere, but located in Minnesota or surrounding Minnesota, the Women's Health Leadership Trust is a great organization really focused on all women in healthcare and networking amongst them, because we need to all support each other and introduce each other to contacts. So within the trust, I will name our last president, our current president, and our next president. So our last president was a woman named Kim Perry. Kim Perry is with an organization now focused on kind of the cutting edge of healthcare called Intelligent. Kim has been a wonderful mentor and friend, and she really is on the cutting edge of healthcare. Our current president of the trust is Dr. Lisa Sauls. So she is at United Healthcare and making great change at United Healthcare, especially in maternal health. And our incoming president for next year is Joy King. And Joy is at NMDP Be the Match. And that's really the National Bone Marrow Donor Registry. And they are changing the world. So she is another just visionary healthcare leader. So I will name those 3 just off the top of my head, but they are also 3 amazing leaders that we're lucky to have with the Women's Health Leadership Trust.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I know
thank you for giving me that opportunity. And I appreciate it.
We probably could do 2 hours worth of mentioning women that are inspiring leaders in this industry. So thank you for being willing to go there with me. I kind of put you on the spot there and really was kind of only limited to 3. But next question is, how do you stay current on trends and your own professional development? Do you have some go-to resources?
I will tell you 2 events I really like to go to. One organization is the Shushmid Connections Conference, and Shushmid is part of the American Hospital Association. It is their Society for Healthcare Strategy and Market Development, and it's mostly healthcare systems that are part of that. But it's really a great organization. They have lots of virtual events and trainings throughout the year, but in the fall every year they do a large event that I just think I learned so much about what's happening in other health systems. This year I'm lucky enough to be on an inclusive marketing panel there. Really just an opportunity to learn what's happening in healthcare. And then the other one would be, there's an event through HMPS. It's the Forum for Healthcare Strategists. That one is in the spring, but again, it's a slightly smaller, very senior organization. And it's an opportunity to hear about what's happening and cutting edge, particularly with a lot of healthcare systems. Excellent. So those are 2 organizations and events that I really learn a lot from personally.
Thank you for sharing those, because I don't hear those come up very frequently in my world. And I consider myself to be fairly well connected to what's going on in health. So thank you for sharing those. They sound like excellent resources for folks to check out. Last question, what's the best podcast episode or book on leadership or marketing that you've consumed recently?
So on marketing, I will can I pivot this a little bit to just do leadership? Because I've got
absolutely.
two that I love and I just would love to share with you. So one is one that I gift more than any other book. It's called How Remarkable Women Lead. And it's, I just can't say enough about it. It's featuring all sorts of women across all different walks of life. And I feel like I've shared it so many times with people. And the other one is a newer book by Ellen Tafe, and it's called The Mirrored Door. And again, it's targeted at women leaders. But she's saying oftentimes it isn't the glass ceiling, but it's the mirrored door right in front of us. That is often the problem for women leaders. So those are two, I think, that for me and for those in my network have been very useful. And I just keep sharing them again and again. And there's a reason for that because they're just such great resources.
Awesome. Well, I am definitely going to be putting How Remarkable Women Lead into my cart and checking that one out, putting it on my reading list for sure. Melissa, this was such a pleasure. Thank you for being here today. Such an important conversation. How can our listeners get in touch with you?
LinkedIn is the best way. Melissa Fors Shackelford on LinkedIn. I love to connect with people, so please reach out. Let's connect.
That's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed the conversation today, do us a favor and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for being part of the Health Marketing Collective, where strong leadership meets marketing excellence, because the future of healthcare depends on it. We'll see you next time.